Hello and welcome. Take a breath, leave the world behind. Your story begins now.
The boardroom of Davies and Winslow Publishing had 12 chairs. 11 of them were occupied by men. The 12th belonged to Mrs. Mary Davies, and she had been sitting in it for exactly 4 minutes before anyone acknowledged she was there. She did not fidget. She did not clear her throat. She simply opened the leather portfolio in front of her, uncapped her pen, and waited, with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that patience, applied correctly, is its own form of power. Her husband had died 7 months ago. He had built this firm over 20 years. He had left it entirely to her, and every man in this room had spent those 7 months assuming she would sell. She had not sold. Here is something worth knowing about 1887. A widow in England had more legal rights than she had possessed a decade earlier. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 had changed things, quietly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. She could own property. She could run a business. She could sign contracts in her own name. What the law could not give her was a room full of men who believed she should use those rights. That was her problem this morning, and she intended to solve it herself. At the far end of the table sat a man she had not invited. He had arrived with 2 of the board members, introduced himself briefly, and taken a seat as though it had always belonged to him. He was perhaps 35, dark-suited, quietly confident in the way of men who have never needed to be loud about it. His name was James Cavendish, Duke of Merlot. He was the firm's largest outside shareholder, and he had come, she understood immediately, to buy what was hers. She looked at him once. He looked back. Then she called the meeting to order. This is the story of Mary Davies, a widow who refused to sell, a duke who came to buy, and a boardroom that neither of them expected to change their lives. I'm so glad you're here. Subscribe to Lovely History if you haven't already, and stay with me. This one is worth it. The first item on the agenda was the quarterly accounts. Mary had prepared for this. She had been preparing for 3 weeks, going through every ledger, every invoice, every outstanding contract with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who understands that her only weapon in a room like this is knowledge, not charm, not grief, not the goodwill of men who had respected her husband. Knowledge. She presented the numbers herself. No intermediary, no solicitor standing at her shoulder to translate. She stood at the head of the table and walked the board through the previous quarter's performance. With the calm precision of someone who has read the same figures so many times, they have become a language she speaks fluently. The firm was profitable. Modestly, carefully, sustainably profitable, the way her husband had always run it, prioritizing longevity over spectacle. 3 new authors contracted in the autumn, 2 established titles performing above projection, 1 printing contract renegotiated in October that had reduced costs by 14%. She presented this last figure without emphasis. She did not need to emphasize it. The number did the work itself. Around the table, she watched the board absorb the information with varying degrees of discomfort. Mr. Hartley, the longest-serving member, was nodding slowly. He had always been fair, if not warm. Mr. Pierce was examining his papers with the focused attention of a man avoiding eye contact. Mr. Fenton, who sat closest to the Duke and had arrived with him that morning, was watching her with an expression she recognized and had learned not to react to. It was the expression of a man waiting for her to make a mistake. She did not make a mistake. At the far end of the table, James Cavendish had not moved. He sat with one hand resting on the table and the other in his lap and watched her present the accounts with an attention that was different from the others. He was not waiting for her to fail. He was simply watching, taking her measure in the way of someone recalibrating an expectation in real time. She noticed this and filed it away for later consideration. When she finished, she sat down and invited questions. There were 3, all technical, all answerable, all answered. Then a silence that was, she felt, slightly different in quality from the silence at the beginning of the meeting. Less dismissive, not yet respectful. Something in between that she decided to treat as an opening. I'd like to raise the second item, she said. The matter of the Cavendish offer. The room shifted. Mr. Fenton looked at the Duke. Mr. Pierce looked at his papers. Mr. Hartley looked at Mary with something approaching attention. The Duke looked at her directly for the first time since she had called the meeting to order. His expression was composed. Faintly, she thought, surprised. I received the offer on Thursday, she said. I have read it in full. I would like to discuss it openly, with the full board present, which is where such discussions belong. She paused. Lord Cavendish, would you like to present the terms yourself, or shall I summarise them for the room? It was, she knew, a small move, but a precise one. She was telling him, and the board, that she had read every word, that she intended to discuss it on her terms and not in a private meeting where the pressure of his title and his wealth could be brought to bear without witnesses, and that she was not, in the least, afraid of him. The Duke was quiet for a moment, then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more considered than that. Please, he said. Summarise. She summarised. She was fair about it. She presented the offer accurately, including its genuinely favourable elements, because she was not interested in misrepresentation and because she did not need it. The offer was reasonable. It was also, in 3 specific clauses she had identified on her second reading, structured in a way that would give the acquiring party editorial control within 18 months of purchase while appearing not to. She identified those clauses. She explained them clearly. She watched Mr. Hartley's expression change as she spoke. The offer as written, she said, would transfer effective control of Davies and Winslow's publishing decisions to the acquiring party by the end of 1889. I do not believe that serves the firm's authors, its staff, or its established reputation. She set the document on the table. I am not prepared to accept it. The room was quiet. Mr. Fenton cleared his throat. Mrs. Davies, with respect, the board has the authority to— The board has advisory authority, Mary said pleasantly. The controlling interest in Davies and Winslow belongs to me. I am grateful for the board's counsel and I take it seriously, but this decision is mine. Another silence, longer this time. She did not fill it. It was Mr. Hartley who spoke first. Perhaps, he said carefully, we might discuss the possibility of a revised offer, one that addresses Mrs. Davies's concerns about editorial control. Mary looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at Mary. I'm open to discussion, he said. His voice was even, unruffled, but there was something in it that had not been there at the beginning of the meeting, a quality of genuine engagement, as though the conversation had become, unexpectedly, interesting. As am I, Mary said, on the correct terms. She called the next item on the agenda and moved the meeting forward, and if any of the men in that room had arrived expecting a brief and straightforward morning, they left understanding that nothing about Davies and Winslow publishing was going to be brief or straightforward for the foreseeable future. The Duke was the last to leave. He paused at the door, not intrusively, just long enough to be deliberate, and turned back to where she was gathering her papers at the head of the table. The 14%, he said. She looked up. On the printing contract. That was your negotiation, or your solicitor's? Mine, she said. He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already decided. Good afternoon, Mrs. Davies, he said, and left. She stood at the head of the empty boardroom for a moment after the door closed. Then she allowed herself, privately and briefly, a small exhale. Round 1. Hers. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Lady Gresham's winter salon, the kind of gathering that mattered in London in 1887, the kind where the guest list was itself a form of currency, and where the conversations held over tea and sherry determined more about a person's professional future than any formal meeting. Mary had attended twice during her husband's lifetime, always at his side, always introduced as his wife, rather than as herself. This invitation was addressed to her alone. She almost didn't go. She had 2 manuscripts to review, and a meeting with the printers on Wednesday, and a son with a cold that had kept the household awake for 3 nights running. She had, in the 7 months since Robert's death, become skilled at declining social engagements on grounds of practical necessity. There was always a practical necessity, and she had always preferred the work to the room. But she went, because Lady Gresham's salon was where the publishing world's informal decisions were made, and she could not afford to be absent from rooms where her firm was being discussed. She understood within 20 minutes that it was being discussed. It was nothing direct. It never was, in rooms like this. It was the slight adjustment in Mrs. Pemberton's greeting, warm but careful, the warmth of a woman managing information she has recently received. It was the way Mr. Alcott from the Literary Review turned the conversation smoothly away from Davies and Winslow when it arose naturally. It was the expression on young Lady Forsyth's face when Mary mentioned a forthcoming title, a flicker of something uncertain, there and gone. She found the shape of it by the end of the first hour. Someone was talking, quietly, strategically, in exactly the right rooms. The suggestion, she pieced it together from 3 separate conversations, none of which said it directly, was that Davies and Winslow was in a precarious position, that Mrs. Davies, while admirably determined, was operating beyond her competence, that there were questions about the accounts, that she was being, and this was the most damaging word, the one that required no elaboration in a room like this, advised by an unnamed gentleman whose interest in the firm was not entirely professional. That last suggestion was a precise and deliberate cruelty. In 1887, a widow in business was already operating at the edge of what society considered acceptable. A widow in business with an improper male association was not a businesswoman. She was a scandal, and a scandal could not hold a board together, could not retain authors, could not negotiate with printers or banks or any of the practical entities on which a publishing firm depended. She did not react. She had learned, a long time ago, that the most powerful response to an attack you were not meant to know about was to give no indication that you knew. She stayed for 2 hours. She was charming and composed and specific. She talked about books, about authors, about 2 forthcoming titles she was genuinely excited about, and she did it with the authority of someone who has read everything on her list and has opinions worth hearing. She planted 3 counter-narratives without appearing to plant anything. She left at precisely the right moment. In the carriage home, she sat very still and thought about who had access to the right rooms and the right ears and a sufficient motive. The answer did not take long to arrive. Mr. Gerald Fenton had been on the Davies and Winslow board for 4 years. He had been, she now recalled, her husband's least favourite board member. Robert had described him once as a man who confused proximity to success with success itself. He had voted against her appointment as managing director in August. He had arrived at last week's meeting with the Duke, and he had, she now understood, been busy in the weeks between. She did not yet know the full shape of what he was doing, but she knew enough. She knocked on the partition and gave the driver a different address. There was someone she needed to speak to before morning. James Cavendish had not intended to come. He had attended the board meeting as a formality, a courtesy to his investment, and an expectation, honestly held, that the matter would resolve itself quickly. The widow would be overwhelmed or persuaded or simply realistic about her position. The offer would be accepted in a revised form, and he would return to the considerably more complex business interests that occupied the majority of his attention. He had not expected the 14%. He had not expected, if he was being precise about it, any of it. The portfolio opened before the meeting began. The accounts presented without intermediary. The 3 clauses identified with a specificity that had required either a very good solicitor or a very careful personal reading. And given what Mr. Fenton had told him about Mrs. Davies' working habits, he suspected the He had not expected to be thinking about it 4 days later. He returned on a Thursday morning, unannounced, which he recognized as a discourtesy and did anyway. The offices of Davies and Winslow occupied the first 2 floors of a narrow building on Bedford Street. Modest but well kept, the kind of premises that suggested an organization that spent its money on things that mattered, rather than things that impressed. The clerk at the front desk looked at his card with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to be intimidated or professional, and settling, admirably, on professional. "I'll see if Mrs. Davies is available," he said. She was available. He suspected she was always available in the sense of being present and working, and that whether she chose to receive him was a different calculation entirely. She received him. In her office, not the boardroom, a smaller room, her own territory, with a desk covered in manuscript pages and 2 chairs that had clearly been chosen for utility rather than impression. A window behind her admitted flat winter light. She was standing when he entered, which he understood was deliberate. "Lord Cavendish," she said. "I don't believe we had an appointment." "We didn't," he said. "I apologize for that." She gestured to the chair across from her desk and sat down herself. She did not offer tea, which he found he respected. "I've been thinking about the editorial control clauses," he said. "As have I. I'd like to propose a revision. A 5-year editorial independence guarantee, enforceable by either party, with a jointly appointed advisory committee for acquisitions above a defined threshold. She looked at him. He had the same sensation as the board meeting, of being read carefully, of assessment happening at a speed and depth that most people didn't attempt in a professional context. That's a significant revision from the original terms, she said. Yes. What changed? It was a direct question. He appreciated direct questions. They were rarer than they should be in his professional life. The 14%, he said, which was true, as far as it went. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sounds of Bedford Street continued in the indifferent way of London. Carts, voices, the distant percussion of a city conducting its business. I'll have my solicitor review revised terms, she said. If you have them drawn up and delivered by Friday, I'll respond by the following Wednesday. That's agreeable. He should have left then. The business was concluded for the morning. He picked up his hat from his knee, and then, not entirely deliberately, said, "The Fenton matter." She went very still. Just for a moment, a stillness so brief and controlled that he almost missed it. Almost. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "I think you are," he said. "And I think you should know that whatever Gerald Fenton has told you about my involvement in his activities, I was not aware of them. I am not aware of them now, beyond what I suspect from your expression at this moment." He paused. "I came here to make a business offer. What Fenton does in drawing rooms is not my business and is not something I would sanction." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a considerable thing to say," she said, "about a man who arrived at my board meeting with you. He arrived with me. That isn't the same as arriving for me." He stood. "I thought you should know the distinction." He left her there, sitting at her desk in the flat winter light, manuscript pages spread around her, expression unreadable in the way of someone processing information that has arrived in an unexpected shape. On the street outside, he stood for a moment in the cold air. He was going to need to find out exactly what Fenton had been doing, and then he was going to need to do something about it, which was going to be inconvenient and probably expensive, and entirely, he found, worth it. He walked back toward his carriage and tried to remember the last time a business negotiation had become this interesting. He couldn't. Mary had 2 children. Thomas was 9 years old and solemn in the way of children who have lost a parent young. Not unhappy, simply careful, as though he understood instinctively that the world had proven itself capable of sudden change, and he was building the habit of steadiness early. He looked like his father. He had his father's patience, and his father's way of watching a room before he spoke, which Mary found both comforting and painful, in the particular way that resemblances are painful when the person being resembled is gone. Clara was 6. She was not solemn. She was approximately the opposite of solemn, a person of strong opinions and immediate feelings who had responded to her father's death with a period of profound grief, followed by a fierce and focused attachment to her mother that expressed itself as a need to know at all times exactly where Mary was and what she was doing, and whether she would be home for supper. Mary was home for supper every night that she could manage it. She considered this non-negotiable. The firm could have her days, the long, dense, effortful days of managing a business that had not been designed for her management. Her evenings belonged to Thomas and Clara. This was the part of her life that no one in the boardroom knew about. Not because she hid it, she did not, but because it existed in a completely separate world from the leather portfolio and the quarterly accounts, and the careful navigation of rooms where she was not expected. At home, she was not Mrs. Davies, the managing director. She was simply their mother, reading to Clara before bed, helping Thomas with his Latin, sitting in the kitchen with Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, long after the children were asleep, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular, because sometimes nothing in particular was exactly what she needed. She thought about Robert in those hours, not with the acute, winding grief of the first months that had softened, not into absence, but into something more like a permanent low note, present beneath everything, manageable. She thought about what he would have made of the board meeting. He would have been proud, she thought. He would also have found it amusing. Robert had always had a dry appreciation for the absurdity of situations, and the sight of his wife dismantling a duke's acquisition offer clause by clause would have delighted him. She did not think about James Cavendish in those. She was precise about this. She thought about him at the office, where it was appropriate to think about him because he was a professional matter requiring professional consideration. She thought about the revised terms, which were, She had reviewed them with her solicitor on Friday, and again herself on Saturday. Genuinely fair. More than fair. The editorial independence clause was structured in a way that actually protected the firm's authors more comprehensively than the current arrangements did. She did not accept them immediately. She had learned, in 7 months of managing people who underestimated her, that the speed of a response communicated as much as its content. She took until Wednesday, as she had said she would. But she thought about the other thing he had said. The Fenton matter. I was not aware of them. She had been turning that sentence over for a week, with the same attention she brought to a contract clause, looking for the ambiguity, the escape route, the version of it that served his interests rather than hers. She couldn't find one. She had, with some difficulty, made a few discreet inquiries of her own. What came back was consistent. Fenton had been conducting his whisper campaign independently, motivated by a private financial arrangement he had with a rival publishing house that would benefit from Davies and Winslow's destabilization. The Duke's money was in the offer. Fenton's agenda was entirely his own, which meant she had been wrong about one thing. And being wrong about things was something Mary Davies took seriously. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening, Thomas doing his Latin at the kitchen table, Clara asleep upstairs, the house quiet around her in the particular way of a house that is content, when she understood something she had been avoiding understanding. She was not thinking about James Cavendish as a professional matter. She sat with this information in the kitchen with the low fire and the sound of Thomas's pen on paper and felt, underneath the guilt and the complication and the entirely reasonable objections her practical mind was already assembling, the specific and unmistakable quality of something she had not felt since Robert was alive. She picked up Thomas's discarded Latin primer and read the same sentence 4 times without absorbing it. Then she set it down and told herself firmly that she had a board response to finalize in the morning. The damage became visible in February. It arrived first through the authors, specifically through Mr. Aldous Crane, Davies and Winslow's most commercially successful writer, whose historical novels had anchored the firm's catalogue for 6 years and whose contract was due for renewal in March. His solicitor wrote to request a meeting. The meeting, when it occurred, was brief and uncomfortable. Mr. Crane had received approaches from 2 other publishers and had concerns. His solicitor was careful with the word, but it landed where it was aimed, about the firm's current stability. Mary asked, with the pleasantness she had learned to deploy as armour, what specific concerns had been raised. The solicitor was evasive. She pressed gently, until he was less evasive. What emerged was a version of the story Fenton had been circulating, the suggestion of financial irregularity, the implication of improper male influence, presented as common knowledge in the literary world. Mr. Crane, a man of conservative habits and considerable commercial instinct, did not want his name associated with a firm in the middle of a scandal. There was no scandal. There was only the suggestion of one, repeated often enough in the right rooms to acquire the texture of fact. She thanked the solicitor for his candour, assured him that the firm's accounts were available for independent review by any party with a legitimate interest, and said she would have a formal response to Mr. Crane's contract renewal delivered within the week. Then she went back to her office and sat at her desk and thought very carefully about what was available to her. The legal options were limited. Slander required proof of specific false statements and identifiable damages, difficult to establish when the campaign had been conducted in drawing rooms and at salons, where nothing was said directly and nothing was written down. She could pursue it, but it would be slow and expensive, and the process itself would generate the kind of attention that served Fenton's purposes. What she needed was something faster, something that addressed the source rather than the symptoms. She wrote 2 letters that afternoon. The first was to Mr. Hartley, the longest-serving board member, requesting a private meeting at his convenience. She trusted Hartley, not warmly, but professionally, which was the form of trust that mattered here. He had been on the board since her husband's time. He had no stake in Fenton's arrangement with the rival house. The second letter was more difficult to write. She addressed it to James Cavendish, Duke of Merlot, and she wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first version was too formal. The second explained too much. The third said simply that she had reason to believe the matter they had discussed in her office in January had developed in ways that affected their ongoing negotiation, and that she would welcome a conversation at his convenience. He was willing. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She gave it to the clerk to deliver before she left for the evening. On the way home in the carriage, she watched the London streets in the grey February light and thought about what it meant that writing to Hartley had been easy and writing to the Duke had required 3 attempts. She thought about what Thomas would have said about this, because Robert had always been honest with her in ways that were occasionally inconvenient and that she had never fully appreciated until they were no longer available to her. He would have told her, she suspected, to stop pretending she didn't know what she was feeling and get on with it. She looked out at the grey city and almost smiled. Not yet, she told him silently. There are things to resolve first, but perhaps, eventually, not yet. James had dealt with Fenton on a Monday. He had not announced his intention to do so. He had simply requested a private meeting, listened to Fenton's opening pleasantries with the patience of a man who has already decided how the conversation is going to end, and then laid out with the precise and unhurried clarity that characterized his professional conduct at its best, exactly what he knew and what he intended to do about it. Fenton had denied it initially, then partially admitted it. Then, when James produced a written account from a contact who had been present at Lady Gresham's salon and 2 subsequent gatherings, stopped denying it entirely. You have damaged a legitimate business negotiation, James said. You have damaged the professional reputation of a woman who has done nothing to merit it, and you have done both of these things in my name, by proximity, without my knowledge or consent. Your resignation from the Davies and Winslow board will be submitted this week. Your arrangement with Whitmore House will be disclosed to the relevant parties, and if I hear your name in connection with Mrs. Davies or her firm again, the written account I mentioned will find its way to people for whom it will be considerably more consequential than it is in this room. Fenton left without his hat. James noted this with the dispassionate attention he brought to most things and rang for it to be sent on. He had received Mary's letter on Tuesday. He had read it twice, once for content, once for the thing underneath the content, which was the careful and deliberate act of a woman who did not ask for help, easily reaching out because she had decided to trust him. He understood what that cost her. He did not take it lightly. He arrived at Davies and Winslow on Wednesday morning, with an appointment this time. She received him in the same office, the same flat winter light, the same desk covered in manuscripts. She looked, he thought, tired in the way of someone who has been managing too many things alone for too long, and has become so skilled at it that most people don't notice. He noticed. He told her about Fenton, all of it, including the written account, and what had been said in the meeting. He did not soften the detail. She deserved the full picture. She listened without interruption, which he had come to understand was how she processed important information, completely, before she responded. The Crane contract, she said when he finished. The damage to the author relation, that's the most urgent practical problem. I can speak to Crane directly, James said. In my capacity as shareholder, a formal statement of confidence in the firm's management, on record. He paused. If that would be useful, it would. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? It was the same question she had asked in January. He had answered it partially then. He answered it more fully now. Because Fenton used my name and my money as cover for something I find genuinely reprehensible, he said. Because the offer I made was made in good faith and deserves to be assessed on its merits, rather than in the context of a campaign I didn't authorize. And because you identified 3 clauses in a legal document that my own solicitor missed, and I have a professional respect for that which makes what was done to you feel particularly unjust. She was quiet for a moment. The city moved outside the window. That's a very professional answer, she said. It's an honest one, he said. There are other answers. They are less appropriate to this office. Something shifted in her expression. Small, controlled, there and gone. But he was paying attention. The revised terms, she said. I'd like to discuss a further amendment. Tell me. A board seat, for me, on the Acquiring Entities Advisory Committee. Not ceremonial, active, with voting rights on acquisitions in the literary fiction category. He had not anticipated. He considered it for the length of time it deserved, which was perhaps 20 seconds. Yes, he said. She blinked. Just once. He suspected she had prepared for negotiation. That was straightforward, she said. You've earned it, he said simply. The 14%. The 3 clauses, the fact that you're sitting here solving a problem someone else created instead of using it as a reason to walk away. He met her gaze. You should have a seat at the table, Mrs. Davies. More than one, frankly. The room was very quiet. I'll have the amendment drafted, she said. Her voice was even, professional. But her hands, he noticed, had stilled on the desk in the particular way of someone making an effort at composure. Good, he said. He stood, picked up his hat. At the door he paused. The same pause as last time, deliberate, earned. The children, he said. Thomas and Clara. Are they well? She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, surprise and something more careful underneath it. They are, she said. Thank you for asking. He nodded. He left. On the street he stood in the February cold and understood, with the clarity that arrives when you stop arguing with yourself, that this had stopped being about the firm some time ago, possibly since the 14%, possibly before. He walked back toward his carriage and began, quietly and methodically, to think about what came next. Spring came to London, in the particular way it always does. Reluctantly at first, then all at once, the parks going green overnight, and the light lasting longer in the evenings, and the city seeming, for a few weeks, almost forgiving. The acquisition was finalized in March. Davies and Winslow Publishing remained Davies and Winslow in name, in editorial identity, and in the chair at its head. Mary's board seat on the Cavendish Literary Advisory Committee was formalized in the same document. Mr. Crane renewed his contract. Two of the authors who had been wavering, reassured by James's written statement and by the firm's continued stability under Mary's management, recommitted for a further 3 years. Mr. Fenton's resignation had been accepted without public explanation. The literary world speculated briefly and then moved on to other things, which was what the literary world did. Mary worked. She always worked. It was the constant, the reliable architecture of her days. But there was something different in the work now, a quality of forward momentum that had been harder to sustain in the darker months of winter. The firm was secure. The children were well. Thomas had stopped looking quite so carefully at rooms before he entered them, which she took as a sign that the ground beneath their life felt more stable than it had. She saw James at the advisory committee meetings, which were monthly. She saw him occasionally at the literary gatherings she had returned to attending, present now in a different way, no longer navigating the room alone, aware of his position at the edge of her peripheral vision, in a manner she had stopped pretending was purely professional. He was careful with her. That was the thing she noticed most. The deliberate care of a man who understood that she had things to protect and was not going to put her in a position where protecting them required her to manage him as well. He did not press. He did not perform. He was simply present and consistent, and occasionally said something in a committee meeting that was so precisely what she had been thinking that she had to look at her papers to compose herself. It was Thomas who said something first. He was doing his Latin at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening. He had finally, after months of resistance, begun to find it interesting, and he looked up from his primer with the considering expression he had inherited from his father, and said without preamble, "The Duke of Merlot came to the office again today." "He did," Mary said. She was reviewing a manuscript and did not look up. "Mrs. Webb said he stayed for an hour. We had matters to discuss." A pause. Thomas returned to his Latin. Then, "He sent Clara a book last about animals." "He did. She's read it 4 times. I know." Another pause. Longer this time. "Papa would have liked him," Thomas said. Not as a question, as an observation, delivered with the careful neutrality of a 9-year-old who has thought about something for a while and decided to say it aloud. Mary set down the manuscript. She looked at her son, at his father's patience and his father's eyes and his own particular careful steadiness. "Yes," she said, "I think he would have." Thomas nodded once, as though this confirmed something, and returned to his Latin. Mary picked up the manuscript. She read the same paragraph 3 times. Then she set it down again and sat for a moment in the kitchen with the low fire and the sound of her son's pen and the quiet of the house around. She thought about Robert. She thought about what it meant to move forward, not away from someone, but forward, carrying them with you into a life they would have wanted for you. She thought about the specific and unmistakable quality of what she felt when James Cavendish said something precise and true in a room full of people saying imprecise and convenient things. She thought about what Thomas had just said and what it had cost him to say it, and loved him with a fierceness that was simply who she was. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a note, brief, direct, entirely herself, inviting the Duke of Merlot to supper on Saturday, if he was free. as there was a manuscript she had been meaning to discuss with him, and she suspected he might find it interesting. She sealed it before she could reconsider. She had learned that about herself. He came to supper on Saturday. He came the following Saturday as well. And the one after that. And then it stopped being a matter of specific invitations and became simply a feature of the week. James at the Davies table on Saturday evenings, with Thomas and Clara and Mrs. Webb's cooking, and the kind of conversation that moved easily between the firm and books and ideas and the particular events of the week. The kind of conversation Mary had not had since Robert died, and had missed more than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Clara decided she approved of him on the third Saturday, when he answered her question about whether elephants could swim with a seriousness and specificity that she found satisfying. Thomas took longer. Thomas always took longer, which was simply his nature. But by April, he was showing James his Latin exercises without being asked, which Mary understood as the fullest possible expression of trust available to a 9-year-old boy. James was good with them. Not performatively good. Not the careful, effortful goodness of a man trying to make an impression. Simply good, in the natural, unguarded way of someone who is genuinely interested in people, including small ones with strong opinions about elephants and Latin. Mary watched this and felt things she had stopped arguing with herself about feeling. He told her properly on an evening in May, the window open, the sounds of the street below, the children asleep upstairs, and the house in its evening quiet. He said it plainly, which suited both of them, that he loved her, that he was not asking her for anything she was not ready to give, that he understood what she was protecting, and he had no intention of asking her to protect less of it. He was asking, if she was willing, to be added to it, not instead of what she had, alongside it. She listened. She had always been a good listener. It was one of the things Robert had loved about her, the quality of her attention. Then she told him that she had known since February, that she had been waiting, not because she was uncertain, but because she needed to be sure that what she felt was her own choice, and not the gravity of proximity or gratitude or loneliness, that she was sure now. I loved my husband, she said. I will always love him. That doesn't diminish. But I have learned this year that a person can hold more than one true thing at once. She looked at him steadily. You are a true thing, James. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I would very much like to be part of this life. All of it. The firm and the children and the Saturday suppers and the manuscripts on the desk and whatever comes next. That's a significant commitment, she said. I'm aware. Thomas will want to show you his Latin progress. I look forward to it. Clara will have questions about additional animals. I'll prepare. She smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has found, after a year of managing everything alone, someone genuinely worth standing beside. Then yes, she said. All of it. Whatever comes next. They were married the following autumn, quietly at the registry office, with Thomas and Clara as witnesses, and Mrs. Webb weeping productively in the second row. Mary kept her name on the firm's door, which caused comment in some circles, and which she regarded with the same equanimity she brought to most things that were both correct and inconvenient. Davies and Winslow published 43 titles in 1889. It was the firm's best year on record. Mary's board seat on the Cavendish Advisory Committee became, within 2 years, the most active seat at the table. She developed a reputation in the literary world for an editorial instinct that was, as one reviewer put it in a profile he wrote without her permission, uncanny in its accuracy and entirely without sentiment. She considered this a compliment. James learned, over time, to present his proposals to her before the committee meetings, so she could identify the problems in advance. This saved considerable time, and he was grateful for, which he told her regularly. Thomas's Latin improved significantly. Clara remained convinced that elephants were the most interesting animals and produced considerable evidence in support of this position. Here is what is worth knowing about 1889. Approximately 30% of registered businesses operating in London were managed by women during that year. Most of them did so without acknowledgement, without support, and against the sustained pressure of a system that had not been designed with them in mind. Most of them did not make the record books. Mary Davies did not make the record books either. She made something better. A firm that lasted, a family that held, a life built on her own terms, in a world that had offered her someone else's. She sat at the head of the boardroom table every quarter until 1911. The chair was hers. It had always been hers. She never let anyone forget it. Thank you for listening to Mary and James's story. a woman who refused to sell, a duke who came to buy, and a boardroom that changed everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Lovely History. New stories, always original, always yours. I'll see you in the next one.